And I thought maybe I should tell this story on my blog, but let's wait. And I forget what the metric was, but I thought I'm going to wait until I hit this number of people per day, and then I'm going to tell this story. And it was a story that about my car catching fire and exploding on the way home from Northwest Indiana, which is a thing that happened. And I told that story, and there's like my blog before I told that story, and then after, and it just like went viral essentially. And that I like, long story short, like I ended up getting profiled on all these things. Like I remember the New Yorker linking to me, and I remember I was in like International Musician and a couple other publications, and that sort of like started this career trajectory that I'm actually on now later. But I kind of took a left turn, went into the world of public education, and I had a kind of a moment. Am I going to go this way or that way? And ended up the blog, it launched all really interesting aspects of my career, and then I kind of put it on hold for a while, relaunched it and the podcast a couple years ago, and it kind of did what was happening in 06, 07. That sort of began to happen again, and that's kind of my career now. Okay, great. Wow. Yeah. I'm curious then with that, because you were in the in the blogging and podcasting kind of earlier on in the mid 2000s. How did were there books you were reading, or was it all forum based? Like, how did you learn about, well, I don't know. I mean, did you get into like SEO and keywords? And I know you mentioned a couple of those, but was that something that was more prevalent in the early 2000s and learning about that? Sure. Yeah. It started to happen. It's kind of like, a podcast I love that if people that listen to your show don't listen to, Fizzle.co, great podcast and great site and source. And I was listening to them recently. They were talking about the, laying down track and hoping that the train comes. And I had the problem of like, I had this big train and I thought, oh, I got to lay down track. Like I had built something that was popular, but I hadn't given any thought to it being like, okay, all these people come, now what, right? So it ended up turning into a business, but it was something that I kind of like went back and gave some thought to. So yeah, I did. Now I have my plugins and I'm looking for keywords that I'm writing, and I did start to do that in the mid 2000s, but it was we're in a different space for that now than we were then, for sure. Right. Okay. So then let's talk about your writing, because is this a recent thing where you kind of started more writing, and are you turning your blog into books, or how does that work? Yeah, I writing was kind of what I did. I still write, and I still put things out on the blog. I kind of left the crazy gig story world because what I found is like those are fun and people like reading them. There's really no business in that besides like writing a crazy gig book, which maybe I'll do at some point, but that's not really what people ended up and continue to come to my site for are like these meaty bass posts that I write and wrote back in the day. I relaunched all this stuff in 2015, kind of knowing that my wife got a job in San Francisco. We're going to move. I have all this stuff I've built in Chicago. Do I want to try to rebuild this portfolio career that I have for myself in Chicago in San Francisco, or do I want to try to do something else? And so I kind of made the decision to leave public education and dig into this stuff. So, but I decided to focus on the podcast actually. So the writing, it's probably like 5% of what I do now, and the podcast is my platform more or less. Now I have been putting out some writing, and I put out a book called Winning the Audition, but it's actually drawn from the podcasts. Okay. So I'm really focusing on the podcast these days, and that's the thing that's really been building the community and that kind of thing. And then the writing is sort of like an offshoot of that. Okay. That's kind of where I'm at with that right now. Yeah. So with your podcast and your community, is there have you developed like a Facebook group, or how do you get your community together and use that? Yeah, and these days, yes, Facebook group is that has been huge. In fact, I could even see my Facebook group eventually becoming like the introduction to the podcast, rather than like you're listening to the podcast, now join the Facebook group. Right. I could definitely see the Contrabass Conversations community. You get into that Facebook group. Oh, there are these discussions that are happening, and then the next level is like going and checking out the podcast. and it's fun to watch how these things have changed. Like if you go back to the early days of my podcast, you hear like me heavily promoting my MySpace, right? And heavily promoting all this. And it's fun to like be in that for the long game. So like right now, mid 2017, oh yeah, that Facebook group is where it's at.
Right.
I didn't even 2015 when I launched it, I don't think I've actually had a Facebook group since like 2008 or 2007 or something, but I went in about a year ago and dusted it off, and I actually was still directing people to my MySpace page in that Facebook group. That shows you like how old it had been. So that, in terms of community, that has worked great. Back in the day, I had forums on my site and that sort of thing, and then I became like a spam monitor. You know, my life just became like trying to deal with forum spam. And so, yeah, if anybody's starting anything, you know, especially like a podcast, man, that's a great way to develop and foster some community.
Mm-hmm. Excellent.
Yeah.
So in addition to that, are there courses or like coaching programs that you're teaching based off of your podcast, or how else are you using your podcast to build up some revenue?
Right. That's like the big question that people have with something like that is like, how do you have what do you do? How does that work? And I think the answer, my answer is very similar to what a lot of other people online do. Like I put out my first course a couple months ago about building your own thing online. I'm working on my next course, which will be bass focused and putting those out. So courses are an element. I have enough of a listenership and my audience is niche enough that I have advertising and I have some great advertisers and there's a lot of interest in that. So advertising is if someone's trying to start their own thing, I think the dream back in the mid 2000s was I'm going to write on my blog, I'm going to do my podcast, and the advertisers will come and I will make my living from these ads and it'll be great. And while that's true for like a tiny percentage of people, that's hard going. It's probably not it's probably not going to happen the way you think. And even if it does, there is an easier path, which is to the multiple income streams, right? So so for me, advertising is an income stream, but then also I teach bass lessons. I do coachings and consulting. So that has come out. That's a piece of what I do for sure. Events, I go and I either speak at events or I kind of manage these different events. I'm going down to Texas to do a live podcast next week, and that'll be live streamed on YouTube and that sort of thing. So people bring me in for that sort of thing. I do some consulting for some companies in the music world, and I've written a couple of books, and those have actually done pretty well. And then what else what's another piece of the puzzle? Those are some of my main pieces. And so I look every month and I see like these 7 or 8 revenue streams coming in, and I think that's a very common way that someone who does a podcast does it. And so I think a good takeaway for listeners is the podcast for me is a platform. It's not my business. My business is the coaching and the consulting and the events and the revenue from the writings and that sort of thing and the advertising, but the podcast is really my platform.
Okay. That's good to know.
Yeah.
So with everything that you're doing, and clearly you're a very busy guy, how do you approach your work-life balance and your schedule? Like, do you have a routine that you do every single day? Are there certain apps or time, commitment things that you do? How do you manage that?
Yeah, and I'll rewind super quickly and tell you about the horrible work-life balance I had back in 2005, 2006. Right, so I was starting to step up, and it was like wake up at 4 a.m., furiously write blog posts. I used to put out 3 blog posts a day, and I did that for several years. So I have something like 4,000 blog posts I put out, but most of them were this like intense, busy period. Then I went back to school. So then I had classes, and then I went and played gigs and taught students. And then it'd be like 11:30 p.m. and I'm like having some argument in my comments on my blog with some like prickly bass player. And so I had and my wife was like, "What are you doing?" And so I went back and I went into the world of public ed, and I was just like, I can't deal with this blog and podcast stuff and do this job. So it went super quiet for the years I was doing that. When I came back to it, I knew what work-life balance, I knew what bad work-life balance was. And so I have very consciously adopted kind of like a regular person work schedule, but I'm doing my own thing during those hours. So, and it's easy for me because my wife is a radiologist. She goes off to work, and radiologists have pretty regular hours. So I'm on the clock when she's gone, and when she comes home, I'm done with all this sort of stuff. So a couple of like specific things I do. And it's different for everybody, but I think it's interesting to hear how people like manage their time. I love hearing that. So I wake up every day and I make a French press coffee thing, and I drink it, and I look at the clock and I think about what I would have been doing a couple years ago, and which would have been sitting in Chicago traffic on the way to my day job. And I smile and I feel gratitude for that life. And I think that's like a cheesy thing to think about, but it's a great way to start off the day. And then for me, I work for a couple hours, and I'm a big fan of the Pomodoro technique. I have my Pomodoro timer going, and I try to get like 4 Pomodoros, which if people aren't familiar with that's a system where you work for an interval and then you get up and do something different for an interval. And for me, it's 25 minutes on, 5 minutes off. And I find running that timer, I like that system because it's simple. It's not like some complex, like sub bullet point thing that I have to go through every day. It's just like I turn on this timer, and then it goes ding ding, and then I get up and I do something different. I stretch, I do some jumping jacks, I move around, and just having that timer going, it lends a little bit of urgency to whatever I'm doing rather than just sort of sitting there. And especially with creative work or big projects, I think it's easy to kind of get lost in your projects and not actually get things done. So I do that for a couple hours. Then about 10 a.m., I go out for a run, and I find that running for me is like a great time to synthesize ideas. And as I get into my run, or like especially as I'm finishing up, and I'm fortunate enough to live in San Francisco, so it's nice weather. I know in Boston, and back when I was in Chicago, the last thing I wanted to do in like February was like go for a run. Right. It was not like that, but here it's beautiful, and I'm looking at Marin, and I'm looking at the Golden Gate Bridge, and it's a very sort of inspiring, easy, way to sort of have a nice state change. And for me, I get so many great ideas, or I'm like, that's the next step I need to do. I get that at like the end of that run. So I intentionally do that, come back, eat a little breakfast or like a late breakfast, early lunch, and then work a little bit more for on creative work. And notice, people listening, I haven't mentioned email once at this point. And I'm a big fan of like the later I can delay email in the day, the less time I spend in my email. Like I do respond to emails. I get back to people within a day, but I try to not start my day off with that, because then it just becomes like that. It's like a very scattered way for me to start.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I'm the same way with that too. I try really hard not to just wake up in the morning and check my emails, because you're right. It's like when I do that, I feel like I'm always, especially if there are emails that I get that I don't like.
Yes.
Then it's like for the rest of the day, I'm either really angry about that, or it's like my focus then has to switch over to that. So I think that's great.
Oh, I hear you 100%. I mean, that's one of those things like, and some of the people that I follow, like, in the tech world, entrepreneurial world, that's like a very common thread, is like getting a large block of time for your creative projects. And for me, that could be something as mundane as just editing my podcast. But as I'm editing them, I'm thinking about what the guest is talking about, and I'm coming up with some takeaways. Or it could be I'm working on this really big project having to do with universities and double bass programs in the U.S. I love these big nerdy projects. Like I can't wait to open up my spreadsheet and work on that. And it's creative work, and it's complex, and it doesn't have easy answers, and just not having any distractions for those hours. I really get a lot done. And then right around noon, that's when I flip into like employee mode, and I answer my emails, and I bang through my to-dos, and I get on Facebook and promote whatever I'm promoting, and I do more of the business kind of tasks in the afternoon. And if my wife's working late, maybe I'll do a little creative work later, but I don't hold myself to that. I try to not. I find that if I work too much, today that robs me of my creativity for tomorrow. And I never used to think that. I used to think I'll just work like crazy, work. And then I realized the quality of what I'm doing suffers if I don't